This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Clarence Jones, who is the scholar in residence at the King Institute. But before he got that honorific position, he has played a major role in the African-American freedom struggle. I think one of the things he'll probably talk about is how he got to know Martin Luther King and became involved in that struggle, which eventually led him to become Martin Luther King's personal lawyer, his part-time speechwriter, a friend and confidant. I think we're very fortunate after last lecture from Vincent Harding to go to Clarence Jones. I hope you realize how unique and special this is to have two of the key individuals with respect to Martin Luther King during the 1960s speaking to you in such a setting like this. So I'm very pleased. I think just on a personal level, Clarence has been a real important confidant for me and other people at the Institute, helping us to make the transition to being a permanent part of the Stanford landscape. And I think he's kind of taken on this role in some ways because it fits with what he did for Martin Luther King. I think that he was always in the background, always helping in whatever way he could to provide his skills for the greater good of both the movement of the 60s and now this effort to create a permanent institution to carry on King's legacy. So please welcome Clarence Jones.
47 years ago, I was a young man, just recently graduated a couple of years before from Boston University Law School. And I'd come to California because I had been encouraged by one of my professors in law school to consider going into what essentially was copyright entertainment law. And this was encouraged, I was encouraged to do this because when I was 16, I was become a professional musician, trained as a classical musician at the Juilliard School of Music, and a jazz musician and a clarinet and saxophone, and to a lesser degree flute. And I continued to play the instrument even when I became older but less active. So my professor said, in effect, Mr. Jones, you know, there are lots of, at that time, there are lots of Negroes, as he said, before the footlights and dancing and entertaining in the entertainment industry, but there are very few behind the footlights in the business where the real business decisions are made. And so I think you ought to consider going into entertainment law. So I moved to Los Angeles to do this. In 1960, Martin Luther King Jr. was indicted by the state of Alabama for tax evasion, criminal, for lying on his tax returns, state tax returns. He had an excellent team of defense lawyers. His chief defense lawyer was a fellow by the name of Hubert Delaney. And Hubert Delaney at the time was also a judge in the New York court system, which was differently, organized differently than it is now. He was a judge in what is called the domestic relations part of the court. And very well, a very able lawyer, very well thought of in the New York lawyer community. For those of you, he is the same Hubert Delaney, was the brother, for those of you who follow theater and culture, was the brother of the so-called Delaney sisters, who were a cultural phenomenon years ago in terms of older women who were putting on theater and off-Broadway and Broadway. But be that as it may, is that he was the chief defense counsel for defending Martin King against the tax evasion. And his other lawyers were two lawyers from Chicago, Negro lawyers from Chicago, both of whom had at different points in their lives worked for the Internal Revenue Service. One, in fact, had been a lawyer and a supervising agent for the Internal Revenue Service in the state of Illinois. And both were certified public accountants also, in addition to being attorneys. And he had Fred Gray, who was a local lawyer, who, some of you who follow a little bit of civil rights history, Fred Gray becomes a constant name in terms of legal representation throughout the civil rights movement. And for the past few years, he may be retired, but I know he was eventually elevated to the Alabama court system. May have been, I don't think he was in the Alabama Supreme Court, but he was on the Alabama High Court system, an appellate judge. Anyway, Martin King is indicted. Judge Delaney calls me up and he says, you know, and he knew me because he had been one of my sponsors, one of the persons who wrote a recommendation for me when I went to law school. And he knew that I'd come to California, and in his mind I had just started my career. And he called me and he says, you know, we need a law clerk. We need somebody who could write and do all the research, prepare all the, go into the law library, prepare motions and look up case law and so forth. And this, by the way, is before the luxury of what I understand, what you have now, at least for those people who are law students or lawyers, called the Nexus. We did it the old-fashioned way. That is, you actually went into the library. You didn't have any computer database. You actually went into the library and you looked for a case by the citation, and you had to learn, and you learned whether the case was, whether it was a state case or a federal case, and whether it was a northeast and southeast. You had to locate the case, read the case, brief the case, summarize the case, and see to what extent it applied to the research you're trying. So he was saying, we need somebody to do that. And I said, Judge, I'd like to help you, but I'm in Los Angeles now, you know. I said, it would require going to Montgomery, Alabama, and being there for 6 weeks. And I couldn't possibly do it. My wife, my wife then, who's now deceased, we had a young child. She was pregnant with our second child. And I said that to him, and I said, I just can't. So, and he was very disappointed. So next thing I know, after having had this conversation appealed to me, I get another call from Judge Delaney, and he says, oh, I forgot to tell you that Martin King is going to be coming to Los Angeles, speaking at the World Affairs, the Quaker group, the World Affairs Peace Council. And he, and I thought it would be, might be useful if he stopped by to see you, meet you, so that you'd get a sense. So this was on a, he called me like this was on a Wednesday or Thursday. And he says, well, he's going to come, he would like to come to stop by your home on a Friday evening. So I thought to myself, the judge never stops, you know. He didn't give up, he didn't accept my saying no. So as I write in a book that I've completed the manuscript on, at least the first major draft, I opened the door one Friday night, and there is Martin King standing at my front door with a hat on, white shirt, skinny tie, what appeared to be a black or very dark suit, with another fellow with glasses who, by the name of Reverend Bernard Lee, comes into my home. I lived in a place called Altadena, California, which is just a little bit above Pasadena. And he came into the house, and we sat down, and he said, Judge Delaney told me about you, and I thought it would be useful, since I'm out here, for you to come and understand what we're trying to do. So he sat down in the house, and the house was a very well-appointed house at the time, because it was an unusual house in that it had a tree in the middle of a living room, and there was and the ceiling was the retractable ceiling, so that in normal, when the ceiling wasn't open, the tree was in the living room, but the ceiling was around the tree. And when you wanted to have to see the stars, you just pressed a button, and the ceiling would pull back, and you'd see the stars. It was into this setting that Dr. King came. It was a very nice, pleasant night. It wasn't raining. So he came in, he said, very nice home here. And my wife, who had a fantastic ability with flowers, a lot of flowers around. And so he comes into this setting. And he sits down and he tells me essentially what he's seeking to do about the civil rights movement. But the core of what he's saying to me, he says, we have lots of white lawyers, lots of white professionals who want to help our movement. But what we need are Negro professionals. And what we specifically need are Negro lawyers. We need lawyers. I don't always want to have to turn to. And I'm very grateful to the support of a number of white lawyers that we have, principally from New York and other parts of the country, but I need lawyers from our own people come to understand that this is their movement too. So I listened. And he asked me to tell him something about myself, and I did. Told him that I had, contrary to what he might think from all of this, is that I was raised in I was an only child. My parents were domestic servants, and before the age of 6, I'd been in at least 2 or 3 different foster homes, and that my parents, who didn't have a home at the time, at the age of 6, they put me in a boarding school run by the Catholic nuns, the Order of the Sacred Heart, and that's where I stayed from 6 until approximately 14, so I got to high school. And I told him about that experience and so forth. And I'm giving you a shorthand version. And I said I would the other thing I said, listen, I'll go to the library every day and I'll research how I can do, I'll research the case, and then I'll do my research and send it. We didn't have fax machines or, what do we have now? Internet, or so forth, email. I would send it special delivery, I would write it out and then special delivery to the post office so that you'd get it. I think special delivery was at least the next day or the next 2 days after you put it in the mail. And he left. Now my wife at the time, this is 1960, so he had been on the front page of Time magazine based on his success in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And he was a star. He was a celebrity, a rock star. And my wife was somewhat taken by this celebrity status, I think. And so she said to me, she says, what are you doing? And she knew what I was doing. I was just trying to get my career together. What are you doing that's so important that you can't go to Montgomery for a few weeks? Well, I felt she was attacking my sense of courage or morality or integrity. And so I said, defensively, I said, Ann, this was her name, I said, just because some Negro preacher got his hand caught in a cookie jar, meaning stealing, that's not my problem. So I'm not going. Well, she was not happy with me, to say the least. Next day, I got a call. This time it's from Dora McDonald, whom I had never met before or heard of before. She says, I'm calling you for Judge Delaney. Says that Martin King forgot to tell you, and Judge Delaney forgot to tell you that he was going to be the guest preacher the next day, Sunday, and he wanted to invite you and your wife to come to hear him preach. So I got that message. Again, I'm thinking the judge just doesn't give up, And I tell my wife, she was, I don't know what month pregnant, but she was not feeling well. And one thing she said to me, she says, you may not be going to Montgomery, but you are going to that church on Sunday. You're going to get in that car and drive 30 minutes on the freeway. If you can't go to Montgomery, you could at least drive 30 minutes to go and hear Dr. King. So I went to this church by myself, where he was the guest preacher, which was in the Baldwin Hills section of Los Angeles, West Los Angeles. Now at that time, Baldwin Hill was still, I think, an upscale place, but at that time, in 1960, Baldwin Hills was the residential place of the black intelligentsia, of Negro intelligentsia. It was the equivalent of black Beverly Hills and Bel Air. It was if you were a successful lawyer, a doctor, accountant, an entertainer, whatever you were doing in black and successful and you had money, you lived in Baldwin Hills. So I go into this church and I go into this parking lot and I didn't, you know, I wasn't doing too bad myself. I had a 1959 Chevrolet Impala convertible. I thought it was pretty good. I drive into the parking lot and I see these Lincoln Continentals and these Rolls Royces, a few Rolls, and a lot of Cadillacs and Buicks, and I said, pretty, you know. So I get into the church. Now I was raised by the nuns, Catholic church, you know, but I understood. I've been to Baptist churches before. It's not like I was totally out of my element. But I go into this church, and after years of working with Dr. King, and I look back on it, then I understood it was very normal what I experienced there. But it was all the pomp and circumstances of the church, you know, big church, maybe about 1,500, 2,000, I remember. But on this particular day, the deacons were all the men who were deacons are in their dark jackets and striped pants, and the women had on their white dresses and white gloves. And I was sitting right behind the deaconesses and the deacons in about the 20th row. And Martin King's introduced. And he's introduced by the preacher, Reverend H.B. Charles. I had never heard or seen Martin King speak before, prior to that time. And he gets up in a kind of measured cadence, and he says, you know, after he says he's delighted to be here and so forth, and he says, the text of my sermon today is the role and responsibility of the Negro professional in aiding the masses of our people in our struggle for freedom in the South. So I thought to myself, smart man. Came to the right church, you know, right pew. He was smart. I said, first I was really impressed. And he goes on to give a much more detailed and eloquent description of what he was doing than he gave in my home, one-on-one. I mean, it was like the most extraordinary oratory, and the substance of what he said was very compelling. And then he came to a point, after talking about the need for black professionals and so forth, he says, and for example, he says, there's a young man sitting in this audience today. My friends in New York, my friends whom I have great respect, tell me that this young man has been touched by God, that his brain, God has just touched his brain. They tell me that this young man can walk into a law library and he can find things all the way back to 1066 in William the Conqueror, the Magna Carta, that nobody else can find. And my friends further tell me that when he writes it down, when he puts what he files down on paper, the words are so compelling, they just jump right off the page. Just the kind of young man our movement needs. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm always, you know, thinking about networking. I'm saying, I want to find out who this dude is. I want to find out who he's talking about, because I couldn't possibly imagine it would talk about me, because at best it was an exaggerated description of me, and at worst it just didn't seem to fit. So I was listening, and he paused, and he said, but you know, this young man told me something about himself. And then I started to, pause a little bit. He told me about his parents, who were domestic servants. And I said, oh, Lord. I sank down on my, and then he repeated what I had told him and so forth. And then he paused and he said, but you know what? This young man has forgotten from whence he came. Well, if I could have just shrunk, if I could have just, you know, I was feeling. And he went on to describe the history of so many African-American men and women whose families and mothers and fathers sacrificed for them to have an education that they couldn't have. And he was a template that's been repeated over and over in the African-American experience. And then he said, and then he quoted this poem from Langston Hughes in a way, in an effort to describe the sacrifice of my mother and a lot of other Negro mothers. And this poem is Life Ain't Been No Crystal Stair. And the lyrics in the poem in Langston Hughes really talks about a domestic woman, a domestic worker in a house, scrubbing the floors, and as she's doing it, she's saying, I'm doing this. In so many words, he says, this ain't easy. Life ain't, you know, don't give up. She's talking to her son, allegorically. She's talking to her son. Don't give up, son. You know, life ain't been no crystal stair, but I'm doing this for you. And beautiful poem. And I knew the poem quite well. And it brought tears to my eyes. It brought tears to my eyes because it was like, it triggered it like an instant video picture of my mother, who had died at the early age of 52 and who never saw me, her only child, graduate from college or graduate from law school. So it had I began to tear up, and I got myself together. So after the sermon is over, Dr. King, as I said, was like a rock star. So he was standing at the entrance to the church, to the pulpit, and signing autographs. And I walked over to him. So I walked over to him, and I didn't say a word, but as I walked to him, he smiled at me as I described it as like the Cheshire cat that swallowed the mouse, you know? And I walked over to him, and as I walked over to him, he says, you know, Mr. Jones, I never mentioned your name. But you know, we preachers sometimes have to use people as an example to make our point. I just kept walking over to him, put my outstretched hand in his hand, and I said, Dr. King, when do you want me to leave? That was the beginning of so I went to Montgomery, stayed there for 6 weeks doing acquittal, get acquittal, and the lawyers, by the way, he was acquitted by an all-white jury in April 1966. But the lawyers who represented him, who were certified public accountants and former IRS agents, they so destroyed the state's case, it was ridiculous. We couldn't possibly convict after they got finished showing how absurd it was and so forth. So I remember him, when the verdict came back, he says, we won. I said, no, you won. When I was speaking, I said, no, you won. So my first thing is, look, I got to get out of here. I got to get back to Los Angeles. He said, no, you got to stay. We got to celebrate and so forth. I said, no. He said, well, you're like my rabbit's foot now. You're like, I said, no, I'm Dr. I was calling him Martin by that time. I said, I got to get back to Los Angeles, which I did the next day. And subsequent events after that, and I'll just short-circuit it, shorten it. What? Did I say 1966? Oh, my apologies. 1960. Thank you. I misspoke myself. 1960. So he went back to Montgomery, and I went back to Los Angeles. And then subsequent developments and events ultimately led to me by 1961, early 1962, playing a major role on behalf of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and more specifically on his behalf, first as a kind of distant advisor with a group of people, and then more and more responsibilities being asked of me and delegated to me, and I ended up really to protect him and protect both of us, being his lawyer, so we'd be protected by the attorney-client privilege. And I handled a lot of personal matters for him, matters relating to his book contracts, his speaking engagements, matters relating to insurance coverage, matters relating to his kids and stuff like that. But mostly matters related to his dealings with the Justice Department, other leaders in the civil rights movement, and concurrent with that, I also became, by default, because he just couldn't do it. I started out by doing research and ended up doing draft speeches along with a fellow by the name of Stanley Levison, who he and I wrote many, many speeches. And as Vincent Harding said, Vincent, on spiritual matters, but on this matter of Vietnam, Vincent wrote the principal draft of the speech, as he said, for Vietnam. The fact of the matter is, what Vincent didn't tell you, which I will tell you, is that one of the drafts, a draft that I had prepared for Martin on Vietnam, he had rejected because it was too equivocal, as distinguished from the appropriate draft that Vincent wrote. Vincent was right down, straight down the money, called it as he saw it. I, thinking like a lawyer, trying to protect him, also aware of something called the Logan's Act. The Logan Act is a federal statute which prohibits a private citizen from participating or interfering in matters of foreign affairs related to other governments and nations. And I was concerned that Martin's too active, visible elevation in opposition to Vietnam might be subject him to charges of violating the Logan Act. So I was more equivocal. And as a matter of fact, the day after he gave the speech, the speech that Vincent wrote, containing most of what Vincent wrote, one of the first things that was raised on the Senate floor was the question of whether or not Martin King had violated the Logan Act. That's one of the very first things they said in Congress. We need to investigate whether, as a result of this speech, he has violated the rules. Just exactly what I anticipated, so I was concerned about that. But let me move away and say that was the beginning of the relationship. So that relationship, and I've been to some of your classes here. I want to try to put Martin King's leadership in context. I will give you I want to talk about Albany briefly, because Albany was an example, as an anecdote in Albany, which indicates a conflict or an impasse that he experienced, we all experience in Martin's commitment to civil disobedience. The mayor of Albany, I think it was Mayor Pritchard, and I may be confusing the police chief, but the mayor and the police chief, they went to Atlanta and get some advice, and when they came back from Atlanta, they filed a legal action in the federal court in Atlanta before they went judge shopping before a judge, I think it was J. Robert Elliott. Elliott was a stone-cold segregationist who had been appointed by John F. Kennedy to the federal bench. So they filed an application for an injunction against Martin King and the Albany movement in the Fifth Circuit, and the injunction was issued against Martin King, C.B. King, Dr. Anderson, leaders of the Albany movement, and SNCC and the NAACP. When the injunction was filed, we were outraged. And the movement and the leadership in Albany, the leadership and the activity of the movement at that time had reached such a level that we had concluded, and certain Martin had concluded, that if we couldn't go forward, it was going to be like taking air out of a balloon that had suddenly been blown up, and that a lot of the enthusiasm and heart of the movement would be dissipated. Plus, just on the facts, felt that the injunction was really wrong. But it was an order of the federal court. So Martin's initial inclination was, it is an unjust law. And as an unjust law, we don't have an obligation to obey an unjust law. Now, I'm only a lawyer. And I was also mindful that I didn't want to actively counsel as a lawyer. All lawyers are deemed to be officers of the court. So I didn't want to actively counsel him to disobey a court order. But that was not where I was coming from when I was talking with him. And Stanley Levis and I were talking with him. We were talking with people in the Albany movement. I said, you have to understand, this is a little different than a law that is enacted by a legislature. This is an order of the federal court. And the federal courts at the time were the bulwark of generally of enforcing court orders, desegregation. And ironically, it was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals with a judge by the name of Albert Tuttle, Chief Judge Albert Tuttle, an Eisenhower appointee, who took no prisoners and had no fears when it came to enforcing court orders under Brown. So we were faced with the question of saying, Martin, what are we going to say to all of these local, state political officials who have publicly said they're going to flout court orders enforcing integration, or I should say enforcing desegregation, if you, of all the people, if you violate this order, you're going to cut the moral ground from under you. He was adamant, notwithstanding that. He said, I hear you, I understand, but this is not just. And at one point, the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, got on the phone and argued with Martin about it. And he became so exasperated, he turned the phone over to Burke Marshall, because he was saying in much more detailed terms what all of our advisors around him were saying. Finally, finally Martin decided that he would not oppose the court order, he would not violate the injunction, on the agreement that we would immediately move into federal court to overturn the injunction, which is what we did and which is what occurred. But that was a great moment of difficulty in which, as committed as he was to nonviolence and cutting and civil disobedience, in our opinion, we thought he was applying it at the wrong time. So let me move away from Albany. Now, Albany has been deemed by some historians as having been a failure in the sense that the movement did not achieve its objectives of desegregation of the interstate bus facilities and local public accommodations. As I look back on it, Albany did not achieve, quote, a visible public relations success, but the success was more enduring in that it was essentially had trained and gave the civil rights leadership and people, the cadre, experience in battle. It had honed their expertise. It had enabled them to see how mistakes were made and how they could move on. So that when Birmingham, so that after Albany, in January of 1963, there was consideration as to what would be the next major campaign that would be undertaken. Albany was from 1961 to 62. And that was a major crossroads. What would we do next? And it was decided that we would move into Birmingham. Now, the decision to go into Birmingham involved some major strategic issues. The first issue was whether you should go there in the first place, because it was known as Bombingham, one of the most brutally rigid, segregated cities in the country, where the police force, both state and county, were fully used to enforce segregation laws. Second was timing. Third, there was the question of the drain on the financial resources of the organization. And then additionally, there was the question of the differences in between the leadership of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the local leadership on the ground in Birmingham. And that really was spelled out in the form of the difference between Fred Shuttlesworth and Martin and other members of the SCLC. And then, of course, there was the question of bail, which became a serious issue. And that related, of course, to the question of a major issue that almost tore the movement apart at one point, and that is differences between James Bevel, whose courage could not be unmatched courage, great courage, who had suggested and was an advocate of bringing and involving school children. Martin and those older members of the SCLC, including myself initially, we were opposed to getting school children, and I mean school children, I mean 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids involved, because we figured, well, they'd be arrested. We were concerned about what would happen in jail. And Bevel was something like a Pied Piper. The kids, in any event, wanted to do something. They wanted to do something. They weren't going to keep still. So Bevel made the point that if the parents can't save the kids, then it's time for the kids to save the parents. And he was very persuasive, but it's not just his words, it's the way he inspired the kids that eventually, it's by default. It's almost like he dragged us into agreeing that the kids would get involved. And then, of course, there was the issue of timing, as I said, but timing not only meant what date, but timing under what circumstances. Now, they were thinking about going into the planning meeting for Birmingham took place in Harry Belafonte's apartment in January of 1963. The actual execution of going to Birmingham was in April, late March and April. And these are all ministers. And the time that they wanted to go was the time, the time that they were initially thinking about going was Easter time. And if there's no other time when a black preacher has to be in church, he can be absent doing a lot of things, doing a lot of times, but Easter is not one of them. Easter, in the Baptist church, the crucifixion, a Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the crucifixion and resurrection, that is the cornerstone. That comprises the cornerstone of the Baptist religion. So whatever, there were people who go to church who miss church most of the time. But Easter is the one time, or one of the few times they will not, they will come to church on Easter. If you're a Catholic and for some reason you're not going to church regularly, it's like you do not miss going to midnight mass. If you're a Catholic, you go to midnight mass. Okay, that's so there was this question of timing, and also the question of whether or not they could launch the demonstrations at a time that would have the most most economic impact. A la a boycott on the merchants. So all of these things were issues. Going to Birmingham, critical question was, when would Martin get arrested? Okay, he gets arrested. And some people say, well, you know, as you look back on it, you know, he just went out and got arrested. No, 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 no. It was the timing and planning of his getting arrested was calculated and premeditated. He and those of us around him knew how to put it in its classical meaning, not in its pejorative meaning, but in its classical meaning. We knew how to be responsive and to manipulate the media, okay? So we knew exactly that if you did something on a certain day, at a certain time of day, you're most likely in those days to get on the national coverage and television news. So when he would get arrested was always important. Okay, so he, in Birmingham, gets arrested, goes to jail, okay? Gets in jail and is very agitated because of a full-page ad which has appeared in the Birmingham News. Full-page ad is an ad by white clergymen who in effect have said, took out a full-page ad and said, Dr. King is a rabble-rouser, an outsider, you know, but for your coming here, we were just on the verge of solving our problems. We had an election and we were, thought after this election we could work out things. You know, we just need more time, et cetera, et cetera. Very critical. Well, when Martin King read this ad, which was really an attack on him, an attack on his leadership, but when he was particularly read it from clergymen, you know, and he knew that he used to say the most segregated time in America was on Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. And he knew that these are white clergymen lecturing him. So he was, so I go in to see him, because as a lawyer, I was one of the few people going to see him. And I go in to see him the first day I see him, and he had started writing on scraps of newspaper that were around the jail floor. And he was writing frantically, answering this. And he says, you got to get me some paper. You know, have you seen this? I said, no, I haven't seen it. And he says, oh, you've got to tell Wyatt, we got to do something about this. So the next, that was in the morning. I came back to see him again in the afternoon. And because I had privileges to see him, I took in under I was wearing a shirt and tie, I put yellow sheets of paper under my shirt and took it in and gave it to him. And I went through this process to enable him to write what became the letter from the Birmingham jail. And I brought the letter out and gave it to Dora McDonald, who was typed and was circulated. And the thing that was amazing about that letter was that for some of us, for someone who had worked closely with Martin, is that you know that he has a PhD from the Boston School of Theology. Martin King was one of the most erudite persons, one of the most erudite, well-read scholars of anyone I ever had met. He was well-read in literature, Shakespeare. He was well-read in the philosophy of the principle of Western civilization, Schopenhauer, Aristotle, Plato. He was extremely well-read about Hegel, literature. So that he had this, and of course he was encyclopedic about the Bible, both the Bible as well as the Jewish religion, the Talmud. Had all of this in his head. So one of the things that struck me after I read the letter and I saw the process by which he wrote it, he didn't have the ability of writing and say, okay, I'm going to go in here and see where does this look for this in the quote. If you read the substance of what he says, everything he wrote, he pulled from his head. He had it. He pulled from his internal knowledge. And I think it is, from a point of view of political, philosophical writing, one of the most brilliant forms of writing that I've ever seen in the English language. Extraordinary form of writing. And I saw the process by which he wrote it. He just was doing it. It was from the heart and from the head. And it was a classic political, religious, polemical statement. In other words, he was taking on, he was challenging intellectually challenging, religiously challenging, challenging everything in terms of those, in that letter. One of the big problems we had as a consequence of the young people getting arrested, of course, was bail. Now, we didn't have any, the kids were in jail and the parents were beginning to put pressure on us, the leadership, to get their kids out of jail. We had done the best we could dealing with a bail bondsman by the name of Riles. And I guess you know how bail works, is that if your bond is set at $1,000, if the bail is at 10%, what you do is pay the bail bondsman $100, and he'll write a bond to get you to get out. So because we had so many people in jail, one of the things I first tried to do was to get him to reduce the percentage. And I said, no, hold on, we're going to have so many people, and the bails were going to be 2,500, 3,000, 1,000. I said, instead of charging us 10%, can't you reduce it to something like 5%, which he agreed to do, okay? But we had run out of money. We had sent appeals for the UAW, they sent $65,000. United Automobile Workers. We sent appeals to the unions, all of our friends around the country. Still didn't get enough money. Eventually, in the middle of this crisis, I'm talking to Harry Belafonte over the phone, and I'm sharing with Harry, I said, we're really going to have a problem here because the community and the press is going to start really unloading on Martin because these kids are in jail, the parents want to get them out. He said, yeah, that's one of the reasons I'm calling you, is that I spoke to the Rockefeller people. He said, they want to be helpful. I think you need to come up here as soon as possible. So I spoke to Harry on Friday night, and I got on the last plane out of Birmingham and came up to New York. Harry had given me instructions that when I landed to call a certain number, and I called a certain number. It was a fellow by the name of Hugh Morrow, who was a Republican speechwriter for Nelson Rockefeller. Hugh Morrow says, well, Nelson and David Rockefeller, they want to be helpful, and can you meet me at the bank tomorrow morning, Saturday? This is 1963. The banks were not open on Saturday. At that point, the Chase Manhattan Bank that the Rockefellers controlled, their headquarters, which is now downtown, Chase Manhattan Bank, headquarters was at 47th Street and Rockefeller Plaza. That's where the headquarters of the bank were. And when you went to the bank headquarters, I say no banks were open on Saturday. I met them. There was a Brinks guard there. I go into the bank, and there's Hugh Morrow, and there's Nelson Rockefeller, and there's David Rockefeller. First time, I mean, not the first time I've been in the bank, but first time when I got to the bank, I get there and identify myself, and we have some pleasantry and so forth, and then the vault is opened. Now, I'd never, except on television in the movies, I had never seen the inside of a vault. A safe deposit box, yes, but I had never been like this here. I was, you know, a vault where they turn the knob like this, and then turn the knob like this, and the door swings open, and I standing there a few feet away, and it's from floor to ceiling. It's nothing but money. Floor to ceiling. Some of it is uncovered, some of it's in plastic bags, some of it's in canvas bags. Nelson Rockefeller walks into the bank, takes out $100,000 in cash, okay? Sits it on the table here, and puts it in a briefcase that I have, and says, this is money for bail that we want to help. And I'm saying, well, geez, what a great, magnificent gesture and so forth. And then there's a fellow sitting over there at a desk. He says, yeah, Mr. Jones, can you come over here for a moment? So I says, yes. So I go over and sit down, and he's sitting behind a little typewriter. And he says, your name is Clarence Jones, you have a middle name? I says, yeah, what's your middle name? Name is Benjamin. Okay, so he's typing out Clarence Benjamin Jones. I said, what's this? He says, oh, federal regulations. This is a demand promissory note. Yes? And what is it for? It's a demand promissory note for $100,000. Now, for those of you who don't understand how negotiable instruments work, a demand promissory note is exactly what it says. It's repayable on demand. In other words, if I give you a demand promissory note, okay, you repay me when I tell you to repay me, because by its face, it's on demand. Now, normally, demand promissory notes go for 30 days or 60 days, so you're on notice. So they run for 60, 30 days. So I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, I'm not even going to kill my wife. I mean, he's asking me to sign a demand promissory note. And I said, well, I just said this, I've done so much for the movement, I'm just going to do it. But I was really upset, but I did it. Signed a demand promissory note. I get on the plane. I go to LaGuardia Airport. By the way, I call Harry Belafonte from the airport and tell him, listen, I got the money and so forth, but you didn't tell me I was going to say, well, I didn't know that either. He said, well, so forth. I said, well, I'm stuck on the promissory note. You weren't stuck. I'm the guy that signed it, blah, blah, blah. So I get on, So I get on, I take the money down, I go to see Wilson Riles. Now we had an agreement, it was going to be 5%, and now I come in with the money. He says, I've worked with you, Mr. Jones. He says, I think we ought to raise that premium up to 10% again. I said, if you raise it 10%, I said, it means I'm not going to get the benefit of the money. So anyway, we negotiated. He took 7.5%, and I've always thought to myself, it's like getting a cab in Harlem. In Harlem, I come from New York. In Harlem, there was a period of time where the so-called gypsy cabs charge you more than a yellow cab on the meter. So every once in a while, when I get annoyed at it, I say to the cab drivers driving around Harlem, when are you guys going to stop imposing a black tax on us just because we can't get a yellow cab? So I figured that this guy was trying to take advantage of us because we knew we had money. Anyway, I come back to New York, go to my law office. I'm told that there's a messenger outside on a Tuesday morning with an envelope marked personal confidential. I go into my office, open the envelope, and there is the promissory note I signed that says it's been paid in full. Well, I know I didn't pay it, but I was pleased it had been paid. Now, Birmingham was really a major, major victory for the movement, because what it was is that Martin King had gone into the jaws of the lion, the citadel of segregation, and was able to force an accommodation. And it was following Birmingham, which was in April 1963, that we then decided that we wanted to try to elevate and bring to the country's attention the significance of what had occurred. And Birmingham was the political backdrop for the March on Washington. The March on Washington was called the March for Jobs and Freedom. How much time do we have? Huh? Okay. March on, and so it was the March on Washington, which was inspired by not just Birmingham, but it was inspired by Albany. It was inspired by the Freedom Rides and so forth. And so this was a major, major event, called together principally by A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Roy Wilkins, Whitney Young, all the major organizations, which was to be like a national political outdoor convention, celebrating the achievements, but also gathering all of the people in the movement to let them know where we are at this stage. That was August 28, 1963. And there were some interesting sidebars to that, interesting things. For example, John Lewis, who was chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, there was some issue as to whether or not he would be permitted to speak, because everybody had to, quote, sort of clear their remarks as to what they were going to say. And John's speech was very fiery and was deemed to be very inflammatory as to what he was going to say, because he had something about, this is a paraphrase, that we're going to march and we're going to continue until we burn down the walls and houses of segregation nonviolently. But it was a provocative statement. And one of the leaders of the demonstration, Archbishop O'Boyle, he put down a marker. He said, we're going to withdraw. The Catholic organization is going to withdraw if John Lewis makes this speech. So we had to prevail upon John to change his speech. So he was one of the speakers, and he changed his speech to accommodate it. Of course, everybody one of the things that was an extraordinary event. It was one of the times when August 28, 1963 was also the time when an extraordinary person that you had studied earlier, Dr. William Burghardt Du Bois, died at the age of 90 in Ghana. And the press let us know that information. And so that the press knew who I was. So I took one of the programs and I wrote a note to Martin, and I had it, I said, you pass this up to Martin King. He went from person to person, he got it, he looked at it, he shook it, and acknowledged that he got it. And in my note I said, you or somebody should let the people here assembled to know that Dr. Du Bois died, and so forth. One of the early visits to the Institute, when I came out here to find out, what were the resources of the Institute, one of the things that really blew me away was that a young man asked me, he says, well, he was demonstrating the data-based capacity of the Institute. He says, Mr. Jones, give me a date. So I said, August 28, 1963. Next thing I know, 5 or 10 minutes later, he brings out a box and he brings out a photostat of the actual program that I had signed. And I looked at that and I said, that's when I knew. See, that's when I knew this person here wasn't shucking and jiving. That's when I knew he was real, you understand? So I'm saying to myself, this is unbelievable that the King Institute had that note. For those of you who've come to the King Institute, that's just one of several examples of the extensive database and access to King documents that Professor Carson and his colleagues have dedicated years of their lives in making it available to the general public and to educational institutions in particular. So we have the March on Washington. And I'll just say the preparation for the speech took place on August 27th in the lobby of the Willard Hotel, and I ended up taking notes and a draft of what everybody else had said, and so I prepared a draft which incorporated the notes of a lot of other people, Andy Young, Walter Fauntleroy, Wyatt Walker was in and out, Bayard Rustin, so forth. Everybody was making notes of what Martin should say. And it was my task to sort of summarize this and put the draft, which I did. And I turned this draft over to Martin. Martin used and changed most of it, except I'm always very proud that the first 7 paragraphs of the I Have a Dream speech, as drafted, are substantially almost identical to the paragraphs which I gave him. The rest of the speech is all different. And by the way, for those of you who, if you watch very carefully videos of the speech, he comes to a point in the speech in which he goes through the written text, and then he pauses after he talks about, we're coming here to cash a promissory note that has been returned for insufficient funds. After he goes on to that, that's about the 7th or 8th short paragraphs. And he leans against the podium and he pauses. Now I was standing just a few feet away from him, he's down here and up here, and I see that he leans back and I see that the text that he has, he turns the text over. And he leans back and looks out, and I say to the person next to me, whoever that was, knowing Martin, I said to them, these people assembled here today, they don't know it, but they're about ready to go to church. They don't know it. Because when he leaned back, that's when he started speaking extemporaneously, and that's when he started the peroration about, I have a dream. That was all spoken extemporaneously. I have said, one of the ways I describe Martin King's oratorical ability, using things from the information technology, he could mentally cut and paste better than any person I had ever known. In other words, he could mentally, in his own mind, not only he would mentally, can take things that he had said before, or separate things that he would cut and paste them as he's talking and put them all together into a comprehensive statement. Brilliant. And we can now all do that easily with our laptops. You cut and paste, you see something, but that's what he did mentally. Extraordinary. So the movement, the speech, the I Have a Dream speech was mesmerizing to everyone. I said, I was not surprised, however, when some 15 days later, that the Klan responded to the March on Washington. And that response was the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was on September 15th, if I recall. 16th Street Baptist Church was the Klan's way of making a statement. You may think you've achieved a lot in the March on Washington, but we're going to remind you that in Alabama, you haven't achieved a damn thing. So they bombed, they dynamited and took the lives of 4 young girls with them. Terrible act. And then of course, I mean, by the way, we thought that was such an act of extreme, horrible obscenity that we called on the Justice Department and the President to just be as visible as they could in support of civil rights. Now, I want to try to give you a historical statement, which I hope you will keep, and then I'll take some questions, because you heard about Vietnam, and I could take you through Selma and the voting rights. I will say a couple of things, kind of disconnected. I frequently get the question asked, who do I think today is most like Martin King? And it took me a while before I came up with a very easy answer, which I would suggest is the answer. That there's a term in the law called sui generis, meaning it's Latin, one of a kind, okay, unique. So I say Martin King is like Galileo, is Michelangelo, is like Mozart, it's like Picasso, it's like Beethoven. They come along once in a lifetime. So there's no such thing. There is no who is like. There is no other person like. And is not likely to be in a millennium. Okay? The historical importance of Martin King. It may be that history will say someday, looking back, that aside from Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which outlawed slavery, that Martin Luther King Jr., in 12 years, in 4 months, from 1956 to 1968, may have done more to achieve political, economic, and social justice in America than any other single event or person in the previous 400 years. Let me tell you something about how pleased I am here to see that you were in this class. And let me tell you something about how pleased I am to be a scholar in resident at the King Institute. My own alma mater, Boston University Law School, is a place that houses some King papers. He was got his PhD at the Boston School of Theology. Morehouse, that Dr. King went to, is a place where after there was an auction, there are lots of documents from the King estate that are now, that were at Sotheby's, but now on display at Morehouse. And because Dr. King was an Alpha, the Alpha organization has led the campaign to fund and finance a national monument and mall to Martin King in Washington, including a statue and so forth. And there's going to be a major mall, similar but different to like the mall in Vietnam and so forth. But let me tell you how fortunate you are. You're not at Morehouse. You're not at Boston. And you're not in Washington. The King Institute, under the leadership of this man here, who, by the way, never met Martin King, knew Coretta King, as you came to know. Coretta King selected him to be the editor of her husband's papers. Professor Carson's been at Stanford for 30 years. People like Professor Carson, and including myself, we had choices, okay? He made a choice that he would take his rather extraordinary intellect and PhD in history and devote his entire professional life to unearthing and explaining and creating a basis for dissemination information of Martin Luther King Jr. So that the King Institute then, in my opinion, for someone who works so closely with him, is today the intellectual searchlight, beacon. It is the repository of where you want to get the core of the essence of Martin King and his legacy. So every day, when you're not doing your studies, every day when you're not doing something else, and you don't come by the Institute, you hear what I'm saying? You are depriving yourself of a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Now, what he doesn't know, so I'm saying here publicly, you see, I'm scheduled to leave August 2008, but I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. I'm going to find some way of staying here because I understand how important, okay? And it may not happen in our lifetime, but you see the Hoover Tower? There is going to be a monument to Martin King somewhere at Stanford sometime. Trust me, okay? And it's going to be because of this man. So that it's important that you see the connecting line between an Ella Baker, I mean, a line that goes from Ella Baker, Bob Moses, to Fannie Lou Hamer, Unita Blackwell, Bayard Rustin, W.E. Du Bois, Robeson. You see all these sort of tributaries, all these things these rivers that flow into all these streams that flow into the main river of the freedom struggle. One of, if not the greatest person to arise out of that struggle, who changed in the 20th century, changed the face of America, is Martin Luther King Jr. And so that as you study those things about the civil rights movement, you should study them within the context of seeing how what went before him and what has come after him enables this extraordinary legacy of his contribution to continue and enable our country to live out the promise of what it intended to be and for which he gave his life. Now I'll take some questions. Yes?
So I guess I'm wondering, had King not died early death, I feel like we remember him a lot because of his death.
Right.
How do you think history, or do you think we would remember Dr. King differently had he had not died and his legacy?
I think I think we would have been unshakable. We would have remembered him with his unshakable commitment to nonviolence, no matter how, what, anyway. Vincent Harding said it well in his speech. He had come to the conclusion that that the nation, at least as expressed by Vietnam, was one of the greatest purveyors of violence. He was deeply committed to nonviolence. So he would have been actively opposed to war, actively opposed to war as an extension of diplomacy instead of diplomacy as an extension of diplomacy. And of course, I think he would have, something I write about, I mean, I think that he would have wanted to refocus our attention on what I believe is the challenging agenda for the 21st century, and that is the commitment to education and the pursuit of excellence. That's where we are today. And those of you who are at Stanford, even if you're not in technology, I say to my friends back east when I describe Stanford, I say Stanford is Silicon Valley. It's the capital of information technology, and it consists of $1 trillion platform of wealth created by a whole new generation of technology. And as Bob Moses in his algebra project says, algebra is the new exercise of the right to vote. Martin King would have said what I'm going to leave you with, and that is, passion, commitment, dedication to what you believe is powerless, almost irrelevant, without knowledge. Passion, commitment, dedication to what you believe is almost, maybe, irrelevant without knowledge, because power comes from the exercise of knowledge. The real power comes from the pursuit of excellence. So that Bob Moses and I, we talk socially, but Bob Moses and I, I've never talked to Bob Moses about the algebra project, but I get it when he says learning algebra is the new exercise of the right to vote, because that's what the nature of the current society requires. Any further questions? Come on, you've got to, no? Yes?
You said you had finished a manuscript. When is your...
Oh, my book, the book, interesting enough, is called What Would Martin Say? Reflections on the Legacy of Martin Luther King, Jr., being published by HarperCollins. It's going to be published in April 2008 on the 40th anniversary of Martin's death. And as a tease, I can tell you what some of the chapters, what I deal with. I deal in the book with illegal immigration. I deal with affirmative action. I deal with rap music. I deal with black leadership. I deal with what would he say to James Earl Ray. I do create a hypothetical discussion between him and James Earl Ray, who assassinated him. I have a chapter on black anti-Semitism. I have a chapter, I deal with what I call the black killing fields. deal with something I said, a commitment to the pursuit of excellence. And I deal with something that stated in a different way, but apparently Bill Cosby and Dr. Alvin Toussaint have just released a book called From Victim to Victor. Come on, people, enough's enough. I deal with the whole question of what I called black victimology. So, but the challenge is that I often wonder when I sat in the room with you watching some of those films, I often wonder what might go through your head when you actually see in a film signs that said colored and white, when you actually saw the signs, you know. That was a part of our country. And I'm a lawyer and I come out of the investment banking business. When I speak to my friends in the investment banking business, I have a different kind of speech I give. My speech is essentially this. You know, these are people making $3 and $4 million a year, and they're managing millions and millions of dollars, you know. And, you know, they went to the Harvard Business School and Stanford Business School and the Wharton Business School and the Chicago Business School and the Tuck Business School and this business school. And then now having these major jobs, including my own son. My own son was 15 years with the Federal Reserve Bank. Now he's a senior vice president of Citigroup. So he's heard me in these meetings. And I say to them, I said, the reason why they can enjoy peacefully their accumulated wealth is because of Martin Luther King Jr. I don't have the time, but I give a speech that draws a line that goes right from Greenwood, Mississippi, right to the Bank of America. Goes from Greenwood, Mississippi, right to the headquarters of Citigroup at 399 Park Avenue. A line that goes right from Selma, Alabama, to the headquarters of J.P. Morgan Chase. So that if those people who think that there's some disconnect or there is no connection between what America has today and what Martin King was able to do in this country are sadly mistaken. That's why I said he may have done more in 12 years and 4 months than any other person in the previous 400 years. Okay, I think that's it. If you have any other questions, glad I'm gonna be here. I'm not leaving, so you know. So you're gonna see me around. 2010, 2020, I'll be here.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.